Lost amid the reputation of the rapacious robber barons of the 19th century is the fact that America in the middle 19th century was a dynamic place of enormous change in technology and culture, with the rise of the middle class. It was a time in which even the descendant of an indentured servant who was born into poverty could rise to become one of the richest people in America, and then go on to inspire the world by going on vacation. The voyage of Cornelius Vanderbilt aboard his yacht North Star in 1853 deserves to be remembered. Cornelius Vanderbilt was, New York's New Netherland Institute explains, not born into wealth. His parents were poor, and his father earned his living by providing low-level transportation services. People of the working class had little time for education, and in 1805 Vanderbilt quit school at age 11 to work in his father's ferry. At the age of 16, he borrowed money from his parents to purchase a small schooner to ferry passengers and carry freight between Staten Island and New York City. He succeeded via a simple method. He charged the lowest price and thus got ample business. Slowly, he acquired more sailing vessels and then moved on to steamships, continuing to succeed largely by underselling the competition. The NNI explains, by the 1840s, Vanderbilt had a fleet of 100 steamships and had become the biggest employer in the United States. His command over so many vessels is what earned him his famous nickname, the Commodore. The New York Times wrote he engaged in price wars, cutting fares until competitors went out of business or paid him to go away. He slowly developed a chokehold on commerce. This isn't meant to oversimplify things. Cornelius Vanderbilt's story was as complex as his personality. To many, he was the very epitome of a robber baron, and he was certainly a ruthless businessman. But he was, by the truest definition of the term, a self-made man. He was a rags-to-riches story, if ever there was. The life and business dealings of Cornelius Vanderbilt could make up many episodes, but there is an interesting interlude that the NNI describes simply as a possibly foolish thing. In 1853, they write, he decided to take his first vacation ever. Why would a man, of whom biographer T.J. Stiles writes, frugality, suspicion, and silence guided his every step, decide to take what can only be described as a very expensive family vacation? For one, age. Vanderbilt was 59, and not a spring chicken, and already thinking of the future. Stiles notes that he told a friend that he was getting old and he'd better close business. This statement might seem odd in retrospect. While a millionaire and what the NNI calls probably the greatest shipping tycoon in the United States, Vanderbilt would go on to many more years of robber baroning. But he was, Stiles writes, brooding on his own mortality. But he was also a family man. He married his first cousin, Sophia Johnson, when he was only 19 years old, and she 18. They would have 11 children reach adulthood. By 1853, he was already thinking about his estate and how to fit in the children and sons-in-laws into the business. So, Stiles writes, in contemplating his mortality and his fractious family, Vanderbilt embarked on a most un-Vanderbiltian adventure. When word spread that Vanderbilt was constructing a new steamship, his friend Reverend John Schulz wrote, many imagined that Mr. Vanderbilt was going to sell his ship to this monarch or that government, or that he was to take contracts for the supply of war steamers. But, Stiles writes, Vanderbilt confirmed to Schulz the wildest rumor of all. Vanderbilt was building the massive 252-foot, 2,500-ton registered steamship to be his private yacht, on which he planned to take his family on a tour of the old world, and Schulz was invited along. Why would Vanderbilt do such an un-Vanderbiltian thing? Stiles opines. Even so monomaniacal a moneymaker as Vanderbilt was capable of normal human complexity. In his own blunt fashion, he loved his wife and children. The yacht was called the North Star. The New York Times described the vessel as doubtless the largest and finest steam yacht in the world. As she moved off from the shore, the Times wrote, many seafaring men who were present declared that she had made as fine an appearance in the water as any vessel that they had ever seen. But there was something more in the trip. The New York Daily Herald reported, although it is solely a personal matter, it partakes somewhat of a national character. The trip, which the Herald described as the first voyage of pleasure which has ever been undertaken from this country, represented the new confidence of the nation. The Herald swelled with American pride over the yacht. The rapid extension of our commerce within the last quarter of a century is without a parallel in the history of the world. It appears as if it were but yesterday that the country emerged from the trials of the Revolution, and yet in the comparatively brief space which has intervened, she has accomplished the work of centuries, and is now advancing to a condition of power and prosperity which must, before she is a century old, place her at the head of the nations. It was an astounding boast in 1853, but as the Herald noted, there are, we believe, only 2 or 3 of the European sovereigns who possess steam yachts, but none of these are at all comparable to the North Star. Scientific American crowed, many suppose that the European aristocracy, those descended from a long line of noble and ignoble and wealthy barons, are the only real wealthy and powerful persons or families in the world. This is all a mistake. Petty German princes and proud English nobles are but men of straw in comparison with some of our democratic noblemen, our aristocracy. All Europe will soon be taken by surprise by a visit from one of our steamship nobility in his magnificent steamship, his pleasure steam yacht, in comparison with which the yachts of the English nobility are like fishing cobbles to a 74-gun ship. Queen Victoria, Tsar Nicholas of Russia, and Napoleon III will get some of the conceit knocked out of them by a private citizen from New York. Perhaps as a symbol that the boast may have gone a little too far, the North Star stumbled off the docks in New York's East River in a fading tide and stuck on a submerged reef. Stiles writes, the Grand Voyage had come to a halt 150 feet from the pier. Vanderbilt had to request the use of a U.S. government dry dock to inspect and repair the ship, something he was able to accomplish, Stiles surmises, because, like the New York Herald, Secretary of State William L. Macy saw the voyage of the North Star as a bit of informal public diplomacy. The North Star did not disappoint. The Herald notes that one of Vanderbilt's goals was to prove the design of his beam engines, and North Star made the crossing to the UK in just 11 days, although the Times of London wrote that the voyage from New York to Southampton might have been made a day faster if she had suffered to go at full speed. Vanderbilt prohibited the captain from testing the vessel's speed, as he was on a voyage of pleasure and was not in a great hurry to get to Europe. There, the people of the mother country were duly impressed. The London Daily News reported, an American merchant has just arrived in London on a pleasure trip. Her salon is described as larger and more magnificent than that of any ocean steamer afloat, and is said to surpass in splendor the Queen's yacht. The Times of London made a shocking admission. Everything on board the North Star is American, and it is very evident that in many of the useful and ornamental arts, the Americans are our equals in point of taste and skill. London Daily News wrote, in this magnificent trip to England by Mr. Vanderbilt, Brother Jonathan has certainly gone ahead of himself, and has at least surpassed everything of the kind hitherto done by millionaire Englishmen. Vanderbilt allowed people to tour the vessel, and thousands did, but even here he impressed the Times of London. When informed that the people of Southampton would like to visit his yacht, he immediately consented, and only stipulated with his agents that poor people as well as rich should see the North Star. The Times made note of something that would surprise an Englishman of the day. The fortune of Mr. Vanderbilt is estimated in America at $9 million, varying nearly $2 million sterling, and he has risen from the ranks. The North Star then went on to tour the continent. The New York Times reported on the 30th of June, the Star left Southampton and shaped her course for St. Petersburg. On her way, she called in Copenhagen. 2 weeks were passed at Havre de Grace, where the Commodore and his party enjoyed themselves in Paris. Thence the vessel went to Malaga in Spain, and from Malaga to Leghorn in Tuscany, from Leghorn to Rome, and from Rome to Naples, where the yacht met its first difficulty. The New York Times writing, at Naples, the authorities refused Mr. Vanderbilt permission to land, deeming it, in their wisdom, quite an impossible thing for a single individual to travel about the world so independently, and fearing some sinister design by these detestable Yankees against the peace, security, and good order of the dominions of his Neapolitan Majesty. Undeterred, Vanderbilt and North Star simply proceeded on to Malta, and then Constantinople, where the Sultan attended in state a mosque which he had never visited before. He did this in order to obtain the view of the strangers. From Constantinople, the North Star crossed the Mediterranean to Gibraltar, then to Tangier, Madeira, and back to New York, arriving on September 25th. The Augusta, Georgia Daily Constitutionalist and Republic noted one of the passengers saying after the arrival, "We have been in Europe Asia, Africa, and America in the past 28 days. Beat this if you can. The Herald wrote, during her absence from New York, the North Star astounded John Bull, was admired by the Russian court, gazed at by the Sultan, and almost frightened the Pope, which completes a series of incidents unequaled in the history of even Yankee ships. The Times wrote that she has stood the trip admirably. Scarcely a strain appears in her frame. Stiles writes that the Triumph was technical. At each port, marine experts pored over the ship. Commanders of the Royal Navy inspected its beam engines. Officers of the Tsar's fleet sketched its lines. Pashas of the Sultan's force browsed through its cabins. And the Triumph was patriotic. American newspapers published accounts of the North Star's progress, reporting its speed and fuel efficiency, describing the thousands of spectators who lined up at each port to visit the gigantic yacht. There was certainly victory in the bit of informal public diplomacy. The North Star and her builder and owner were something uniquely American, and Europe noticed. The Times of London wrote a surprisingly candid take on the North Star. Listening to the details of the grandeur of this new floating palace, it seems natural to think upon the riches of her owner, and to associate him with the Cosmo de Medicis, the Andreas Fuggers, the Jacques Coeurs, the Richard Whittingtons of the past. But this is wrong. Vanderbilt is a sign of the times. The medieval merchants just named stood out in bold relief from the great society of their day. Mr. Vanderbilt is a legitimate product of his country. The great feature to be noticed in America is that all its citizens have full permission to run the race in which Mr. Vanderbilt has gained such immense prizes. In other countries, on the contrary, they are trammeled by 1,000 restrictions. Your men of rank here, your makers of millions for themselves and tens of millions for the country, too often spend their time, their intellect, their labor in order that they may be able to take rank among a class of men who occupy their present position in virtue of what was done for them by some broad-shouldered adventurer who, fortunately for them, lived 800 years ago in Normandy. While Vanderbilt had made an effort to protect his interests while he was away, it was a time of cutthroat business, and his enemies moved against him and his businesses. And being Cornelius Vanderbilt, upon returning from his vacation, he ruthlessly destroyed them. But the vacation was over, and the North Star, whom the Reverend Schulz described as probably the strongest, fastest vessel of her tonnage afloat, was turned into a passenger and mail steamer. She was finally broken up in 1866. The nation might have thought that the voyage of the North Star proved that we were an equal of European nations, but the coming Civil War might have cooled that fervor some. There was still quite a lot of growing pains ahead. Still, the voyage of the North Star and her owner proved something about middle-nineteenth century America, as the Times of London noted. It took Florence 15 centuries to produce one Cosmo de Medici, and she never brought forth another. America was not known 4 centuries ago, and yet she turns out her Vanderbilts, small and large, every year. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.